Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, inspiration, and connections from all flavours of Passive House, check out passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, get your questions answered, and contribute to the community dialogue. There's loads of free information for experienced professionals and people just starting out on their Passive House journey. We hope to see you at one of our weekly Passive House Accelerator live webinars. In the meantime, here's this week's Passive House podcast. G'day and welcome back to another regular episode of the Passive House podcast. I'm Matthew Cutler-Welsh, coming to you from Auckland in New Zealand.
And I'm Zack Semke, coming to you from Seattle, Washington.
How's everything going, Zack?
It's good. It's crystal clear today and super cold for this area. It's below freezing, which is by this time of the year a little bit out of the ordinary. The Olympic Mountains are dusted in this beautiful layer of white snow. It's gorgeous right now. Nice. How about for you?
Nice. Well, we had another dumping of rain. I haven't looked at the rain gauge this morning, but east coast of North Island is still in not a great state. I did speak to a number of people this week who had had a few days without power, without internet. Some of them north of Auckland, but a lot of people still are struggling a lot down the east coast of the North Island. So, yeah, still thinking of them. And it's definitely cooling down as well. By the time this comes out, it will be pretty much the end of summer for us. So heading into autumn, days getting shorter. Right. Not having power on could start to get even more problematic. But I have been quite amazed at how rapidly some of our utility operators have sorted that out and got power back on. It's going to take a little while longer to get a lot of the roads sorted out. And then, of course, the big work of figuring out what to do with all the houses that don't just need drying out. They're going to need a lot of work and possibly some consideration of where those houses and if those houses should be rebuilt in the location that they were. So, some tough times ahead for quite a few people as we approach the end of summer in our part of the world, but hopefully things will warm up for you. We're going to Massachusetts today.
Indeed. Massachusetts is where it's at in North America right now. So it's fun. This was a really fun conversation with Andrew Steingiser of RDH. Yeah, it's good stuff.
Well, Leah, excited to get into that. So before we do, let's do a quick shout out to our sponsors.
Yeah, absolutely. So everything we do at the Accelerator, including the Passive House podcast, comes thanks to generous support from our sponsors. So a big thank you to our founding sponsors, 475 High Performance Building Supply, Baxt Ingwe Architects, Glavel Foam Glass Gravel, Minutair All-in-One HVAC and Dehumidification Units, Mitsubishi Electric Train HVAC US, Partel, Rockwell North America, Stocorp, and Zola Windows. Thanks too to our champion sponsors, Icon Windows and Doors, Intelligent Membranes, Proseco, and Source 2050. And a big thank you to our stakeholder partner, NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority.
Very good. All right. Tell us about our guest this week, Zack.
Yeah. So Andrew Steingiser is an associate, senior project architect, and passive house consultant at RDH Building Sciences Boston office. And as listeners are probably aware, there's a lot going on in passive house in Boston and Massachusetts. So, and that's true at the code level, which we're going to talk with Andrew quite a bit about. And of course, also at the real world in the dirt level with new projects. So we dive into all that and more in this conversation. I have Andrew Steingiser here. Andrew, thank you for joining us on the Passive House podcast.
Thanks, Zach. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I'm super excited to hear about your work at RDH and also about a bunch of exciting code development in Massachusetts. So, but before that, I want to share with folks that you are an associate, senior project architect, and passive house consultant at RDH Building Sciences Boston office, which must be a very hopping place these days, given all that's going on in passive house in Boston and Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Super cool. I mean, what was your path to passive house? How did you get there?
Well, so, my background is I'm an architect, and I've practiced as an architect almost my whole career so far. I landed at RDH Boston 2 years ago to lead our passive house consulting practice for this office in close coordination with our other offices, including Toronto in particular. But before that, I've been practicing most recently as a project architect, most recently on two of the first, actually the first FIAS certified student residence halls in Massachusetts, one at Wheaton College and one at Williams College. So I had some recent experience leading the design and realization of those projects as an architect. But backing up further, I started out like most other architects, idealistic, coming out of school, going to save the world through design, and quickly faced a lot of the realities of practicing architecture. There's a way of doing things, right? It often involved a design process where we would design basically whatever we liked, and then sometime closer to permitting, check in with the mechanical engineer,
right,
confirm that the energy model was compliant. We didn't even know what compliant really, well, I didn't, what compliant actually meant. And then, we're on our way. I think, when I discovered Passive House a few years into my career, it flipped a switch for me, and I couldn't go back. I took the FIAS training in 2013. Up at the Yestermorrow Design Build School, the in-person session, and Katrin was there and others, and it was an intensive boot camp, and I loved it. And but just before that too, I'd been participating in some of the early symposia for Passive House Massachusetts here in the Commonwealth, and I just couldn't get over the collaborative nature of all these professionals sharing information, what otherwise would be trade secrets, and just collaborating and supporting each other. And when I discovered that, I thought I have to be a part of this community as well. So since taking the training, it's been full steam ahead on attempting to do better in every aspect of the project, whether it's specifically a high performance Passive House project or not.
Yeah. Well, that experience is sounds really profound, and it's one that I've heard echoed by other practitioners. That kind of discovery of this rubric for essentially kind of taking responsibility for energy performance within the design process, as opposed to kind of having it be a little bit of an just handled by others, honestly, right? I mean, is a little bit.
Absolutely. Passive House showed me the way that, in an early phase, Passive House or energy performance in general can be a tool and a guide to literally shaping the building and confirming its ongoing performance through subsequent design phases, which is a key difference. And this is something that we're seeing reflected more in upcoming codes as well.
Right. A little teaser there. So, I mean, what you mentioned the two student residences, and so that was work that you did prior to joining RDH. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
At an architecture firm called SGA here in Boston.
Nice.
And I was project architect on those projects and developed a lot of the enclosure detailing, and particularly for Wheaton, was out there at the job site every Tuesday morning at 7, having the job meetings in the trailer, and then walking the site and checking, doing my field reports, and it was informative to not only design a Passive House project, but participate in the construction and administration process as well, through its verification with VIAS as well. So a very, very informative experience, and I wanted to do that all the time moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's pivot then to your role at RDH, because that probably is what's happening at RDH. So what do you do there?
So as I mentioned, I'm leading our Passive House consulting practice for the Boston office.
Yeah.
And that's not limited to Passive House either. I'm working in general energy and sustainability projects integrated with building enclosure. So I'm also providing building enclosure consulting. That's very much what RDH Boston has been known for the last several years. Since we've opened here, we've been very focused on our building enclosure consulting, with our deep roots in enclosure consulting and testing at like in our Waterloo office with John Straub and those folks there. Mm-hmm. But in Boston, we have recently expanded services to include a much broader focus on energy and sustainability integrated with building enclosure consulting. We participate in deep energy retrofit work of existing buildings, new construction, Passive House projects, multifamily, sometimes more challenging typologies we're seeing coming up as well. Providing an integrated building enclosure consulting for that as well.
And give us a sense of the kind of scale of, or your docket, like how many projects are you all working on now? And what is the kind of volume of work that's underway in Massachusetts?
Yeah, the work in Massachusetts is really taking off now. Our office here is growing. I think we're about up to 15 people here now. We recently renovated our office and expanded, and we're continuing to grow as a result of the demand for high performance buildings in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. A lot of our work is focused on large scale commercial, multifamily residential, office, lab space. And we perform energy modeling and the enclosure work, hopefully starting at an early phase for a lot of these projects, to again shape the design and confirm ongoing compliance, as I was mentioning before. A lot of things we're familiar with from Passive House.
Awesome. So there's a reason that there's this uptick in projects, and so let's dive into that a little bit, or at least one of the things that's driving that, and that's Massachusetts' new stretch code and opt-in specialized code, which is considerably more stringent than previous code, and in some cases requires Passive House certification. So I know RDH was kind of integrally involved in the development of that. So maybe we could start by talking a bit about what that role was for RDH.
Sure. Yeah, and it's a very exciting time in Massachusetts. I really feel I'm in the right place at the right time for the type of work that I'm personally interested in, and that is absolutely critical for moving the needle on our carbon reduction goals. So RDH was invited to serve on the Stretch Energy Code Technical Advisory Committee by the Massachusetts Department of Energy and Resources, DOER for short. They're the state agency responsible for writing the new energy codes. And we were invited by DOER to review and propose amendments towards finalizing the new Massachusetts Stretch Energy Codes. And we participated among a committee of industry experts in doing so. And we contributed to authoring updated building enclosure requirements pertaining to airtightness, accurate accounting of thermal performance of assemblies, including glazing systems, as well as updated and more comprehensive building code definitions to accompany these more specific and stringent requirements.
Got it. So at the ground level, as these new rules were being developed and implemented, so what could you walk us through some of the details of the stretch code and the opt-in specialized code, and how it's different from kind of more conventional code?
Sure. So our architects who work in Massachusetts should be aware that the recent changes in the code were released in December 2022 by DOER. This is part of the updated 10th edition of the Massachusetts Building Code, and the new base energy code includes updates to the stretch energy code, as well as a second additional, more advanced tier of stretch energy code known as the specialized opt-in stretch code. Now, stretch code in Massachusetts is something that's been there in the past. And typically it applies to buildings larger than 100,000 square feet. And traditionally, it was based on an ASHRAE 90.1 Appendix G model with a target of doing 10% better than that base model. And that's what we've been doing for several years in the last couple code cycles. And to date, 299 of the 351 municipalities in Massachusetts are already enrolled in the previous stretch code. So they will continue to follow the updated stretch energy code, and towns that vote to adopt the new specialized opt-in stretch code will be held to the requirements of that more advanced tier.
Got it. So before, just to pause a moment, so the ASHRAE 90.1 Appendix G, 10% better than that, is still probably using considerably more energy than a passive house building would, or what's the kind of the comparison there?
Yeah, I mean, it's substantially more energy. As we know, passive house buildings can reduce overall EUI anywhere from 60 to 80, 90%, depending on the typology of the building and scale. So, this represents a shift towards, in general, more absolute metrics in the building code rather than the sort of percentage better than approaches, right? And that's across the board. There's several different paths as well that are really dependent on a building typology and size.
So you have all these communities that have signed on to the stretch code at that ASHRAE 90.1 Appendix G, 10% better than that level, who are then going to commit to passive house levels of performance in this new version. Yes.
Correct. Yeah. In many cases, passive house is required, particularly in that specialized opt-in code for commercial and multifamily residential. Multifamily buildings greater than 12,000 square feet are going to be required to be passive house. There's some different dates where that's phased in. Immediately, less than 5 stories, low rises are immediately now required to follow passive house for code compliance. And there's a window of a year. So January 1st, 2024, the high rises will follow as well. So in a year, all multifamily residential under the opt-in code will be required to be passive house certified.
Right. So, and then the idea here is the stretch code and the opt-in element of it as well are meant to kind of lead the market, lead the community practice, so that hopefully at some point we see this become code. Is that true? Is that a fair assessment or characterization of the landscape there?
I think so, Zach, because we're seeing passive house required by code in these cases, And in the cases where they're not specifically, a lot of the same steps in the design process will need to happen. A lot of the same things will be required. There's now air tightness requirements, minimization of thermal bridging,
right,
and documentation towards proving that, for code compliance in the other paths as well. So a lot of things that we're familiar with in the Passive House community are sort of being rolled out in general across the various compliance paths, regardless of what they are.
That's exciting. So we've heard from Bev Craig about some of the incentive programs and kind of structures that encourage Passive House projects from both provided by Mass CEC and Mass Save, I think, is where a big chunk of those are. Is there an opportunity, or can those incentives support projects that are going through the stretch code? Or so is there, I guess, an interaction and kind of reinforcement that the incentives can make to this move to the stretch code?
Sure. And that's one of those things that's really unique about Massachusetts currently right now too. And Bev Craig is an absolute expert in these incentive programs, among others who work for the Mass Save program, colleagues of ours. And yes, there are programs in place. One of the successful ones that is being well utilized currently is a new construction Passive House incentive offered by Mass Save, where there are various steps, little carrots to lead the design team through the Passive House design process, starting with an initial stipend for a feasibility study, including initial energy modeling via either of the institutes, and subsequent phases, incentives for ongoing energy modeling, and then other incentives when there's design certification or pre-certification reached, and then upon completion there are further incentives as well. So it aims towards at least opening the door to exploring Passive House for those projects that are interested in them, or perhaps now are required to meet that level of performance. And ongoing encouragement to continue pursuing certification. And they're substantial. I ran the numbers for a multifamily high-rise we're looking at, and it amounted to somewhere in the ballpark of $650,000 of rebates for the project. So,
right,
it's a healthy program.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there are some parallels. I think of two parallels that happened in very different parts of the world. So I mean, the incentives was like $650,000 for what, roughly how many square feet project?
Let's see. On hand, I think it was about 250,000 square feet.
I think of the Brussels, the story in Brussels, and the exemplary buildings program, and the incentives that were provided for those buildings, and what a difference that made in kind of helping to get new teams to jump over this that initial hurdle of maybe being a bit afraid of doing Passive House, and the learning curve that means there's more expense to do Passive House. What you're describing also really resonates, I think, or harmonizes with what's happening in British Columbia with their step code, and that kind of setting. I mean, I think that the top tier it used to be more clearly Passive House. I think it's a little bit less clear there, but it's very close to Passive House. And by stepping, having these kind of tiers that jurisdictions can opt into going to a higher tier earlier than they need to, but everybody knows that eventually they're going to get to that top tier. It helps the market and the industry understand where everything's headed, and so it makes it, I think, it helps to incentivize naturally early adopters, because they know that they're not going to, if they just go all the way, They know that they're not going to have to kind of relearn every 3 years, which is, I think, as a one of the arguments against evolution of building code every 3 years is, hey, we have to relearn it every 3 years. So knowing the target is really helpful.
Sure, absolutely. And it should be noted that our main office in Vancouver, a lot of our industry leaders in Passive House out of that neck of the woods have had a hand in helping develop that step code along the way, and really shaping the energy landscape in that city as well. And it's interesting you mentioned that, because I know through conversations with some of the folks at DOER here, they were looking at Vancouver's model when designing this second, more advanced tier of stretch code here as well. So it becomes a program very much like BC's step code, and there's a lot of parallels between Vancouver and Boston now. Speaking with my colleague Monty Paulson, he looks at Boston and has said that, Boston looks a lot like Vancouver did like 5 years ago. Mm-hmm. We're taking steps forward, heading towards absolute metric targets, and Passive House levels of performance being incorporated in a somewhat stepwise process into code. Absolutely.
Yeah. It's great. Great to hear Monty's name. Monty is of course instrumental in so much of the work of the Passive House Accelerator, especially when we were just getting going with all of the happy hour programming. So
absolutely, and it's a real privilege to actually be able to work with these folks between all our offices. We have a really deep bench of Passive House experts and some deep pedigree in the field. So it's actually quite an honor and privilege to be working among those folks as well.
Yeah, I bet. So we have the new stretch code set up in Massachusetts. Has it been in place long enough to start having an impact on the market and what's happening? What are you seeing on the ground?
It's interesting. Yeah. It's for some prospective clients or people looking to build a building out there, it may be a rude awakening. But for those who have been used to considering energy and might have interest in Passive House, this isn't such a far reach. But right. Yeah, absolutely. One project I'm working on now, we anticipate the municipality it's in to adopt the opt-in code before the date at which we're going to permit the project. So we're anticipating needing to comply with the Passive House requirements. So we are designing that project to be Passive House compliant, certified rather, as a code compliance path. So we're already rolling up our sleeves and doing that. And other projects we're writing proposals for currently don't necessarily fall under the Passive House path. Rather, for instance, a proposal we were just looking at for a school targeting net zero performance. Well, schools are one of those program types under the new code that falls under the TEDI pathway, the thermal energy demand intensity pathway, the metric regarding annual heating and cooling demand limits, similar to what Passive House does.
Yeah.
One aspect limiting that annual heating demand. But that's achieved through a lot of the same methods. Careful attention to the building enclosure detailing, airtightness, adequate R value, minimizing thermal bridging, form factor of the building, percentage glazing, all the things we tend to look at in Passive House, in addition to balancing enclosure with mechanical systems, energy recovery, ventilation, efficiencies. Everything in that energy budget needs to be considered, and considered early now. And that's being reflected in how we're proposing to work on that project now too. We expect to deliver more comprehensive studies for code compliant projects now, as we would early on with Passive House projects. There's going to be a similar process where you have to think a little bit about everything on day one.
Yeah.
With all the stakeholders and design team at the table, and think a little more about that level of design that you might not consider until design development, but perhaps during schematic design.
Right. So a couple of things there. So first, a question with the school example and the thermal energy demand intensity target that as an alternative, like that's what they're going to need to hit as opposed to Passive House. Is that thermal energy demand intensity number similar in the same range as Passive House? Is it double, or where does that hit?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. We've been diving into that, looking at that in the new code, and there's a table of TEDI targets for both heating and cooling, and it varies by program type of the building. So in that table, it varies. Mm-hmm. From the instances we've looked at, for instance, that school project has a heating TEDI requirement of 2.2 kBTU per square foot per year. I mean, if we look at PHI standards, 4.75 is where we are, right?
Right.
So in this case, it's like half of really the TEDI we might see. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So already now it's interesting. I'm not sure. I know DOER carefully developed this new code initially. I believe Stephen Winter Associates was involved in that. So they were in good hands developing this code. It's going to be interesting because in some cases, Passive House may be less stringent and more achievable than the TEDI requirements. The TEDI requirements are a minimum requirement for some of these program types in the code, but Passive House remains a code compliance option for all building types. So even in the TEDI scenario, you could choose to pursue Passive House instead. Mm-hmm. In some cases, that might make sense. Mm-hmm. It may open the door to potentially less stringent requirements in some areas.
That's awesome. So they're really interesting, and I mean, I confess to being surprised that for at least schools that it's actually more stringent than the kind of PHI target. And so the other thing is I'd love to hear you talk about how liberating it must be to be able to say, hey, this is code, guys. I mean, that's what that must completely transform the conversation.
It does, because, those of us in the Passive House community strive to these levels of performance. And, it's an issue sometimes of education and awareness about Passive House and having to convince a client sometimes. You well know. Trying to make a case for Passive House, demonstrating the return on investment, right? The long-term payback was, often where we started, and for certain clients that made more sense, and a higher education client that bears the long-term operating costs of a building or buildings on their campus really see that long-term payback. So that's an easier pitch than to a traditional developer client that maybe they're going to sell that building right away. They're not going to benefit from the long-term payback immediately themselves, unless there's value in the marketing potential of the performance levels of a Passive House building, which has to be appreciated. I mean, looking at the big picture. So, I mean, that's where we were traditionally, but now the conversation transforms a bit where, hey, this is required. So we just forego all this, what ifs and what have yous, and dive into, okay, how do we get from point A to point B?
Yeah. That's amazing. Yeah, it's cool. It also harkens back to a term that Tim McDonald, I think, coined, which is this notion of the new gravity in architecture. So like there's code, of course, engages with the realities of gravity in buildings, that you have to make a building that's going to stand up and deal with, seismic issues and all of those. Architecture, of course, does too. I mean, that's fundamental to architecture. And his argument is that energy performance and the carbon implications of that are imperatives as well. So in that way, they're the new gravity. And that's beginning to be reflected in the decisions that lawmakers are making, and policymakers are making, and having that kind of like, this is just the way it's done. We got to do buildings now. So it is really heartening and to see that manifesting itself in the United States of America. There's so many examples from other countries of leadership. I mean, I mentioned Brussels.
You mentioned Brussels. I always look at that in awe. Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and it has had such a massive impact, I think, on the world. Really, honestly, I think it's inspired. It inspired what happened in Vancouver and therefore British Columbia, and now Toronto and Ontario. It's inspired what's going on in New York with the Buildings of Excellence program, and I know it's inspired what's happened in Massachusetts. So cool to see what's happening.
Absolutely, and it's fundamentally that's a great phrase from Tim McDonald. That's absolutely true, and this sort of move to requiring it by code is sort of going to fundamentally change the design process of our buildings. As I mentioned before, it's going to shift a lot of considerations earlier into the design process, where, again, no longer are we designing however we like and then checking some model prior to permitting later. We're going to set out in schematic design now, in that Teddy case, to check and make sure our default assumptions for R values, U values, and mechanical equipment are going to get us there before we go too far, and then address those components accordingly. And it literally will shape the building. If we need a more efficient form factor or shifting fenestration around, we're going to need to consider that very early before the project goes too far, because those things matter to historic commissions, through the entitlements process for getting a design approved. All those things matter. The massing for zoning. So it's going to fundamentally shift the design process, and architects and design teams are going to need to think more about some of these things earlier.
Well said. That's really great. So this has been awesome, Andrew. Thank you so much for this conversation. I think that lots of listeners will be inspired by what's going on in Massachusetts, and I'm looking forward to my next visit to seeing the latest on the ground. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we close up?
It's an exciting time to be practicing. I'm more hopeful than ever, and in the recent FIAS conference, the sense of urgency was palpable.
Yeah.
At that conference, and I think those of us in this community are really sensing that, and I'm just encouraged that I can participate in a process in a place now that takes steps forward, and look forward to supporting the projects in Massachusetts moving forward, and hopefully carrying that example to other places as well.
Yeah, well, you're in a great spot, and keep up the good work.
Andrew Steingiser there from RDH. Always a pleasure to have one of the team from RDH do some fantastic work, and certainly I think they've influenced right down to New Zealand here, some of the first learning about building science in general was heavily influenced by some of the team at RDH and some of the people that had visited their colleagues there and gone to summer camp and places like that. They definitely helped to increase that knowledge and spread the whole concept of building science globally. So really cool. And obviously Andrew has a pretty impressive background, quite modest, I felt.
Mm-hmm.
Just super amicable kind of guy, but obviously very knowledgeable with some great experience as well. I guess the most exciting thing for me, the big standout, is that spread of the concepts of the stretch code. And we've had lots of guests on the show, and we've talked a lot about the origins of the set code and the energy stretch code from Vancouver, spreading out to BC, and now coming into the States. And in fact, we've got something very similar. Of course, it's got a different name, but it's the concept of having a roadmap that tells the industry very clearly where things are heading, so that the market can then decide where they want to be on that, rather than having to just react to minimum standards every few years. So that approach makes a lot of sense, and it's great to be to hear that it's being widely adopted around the place.
Yeah, really powerful model, and cool to see these different sort of versions and iterations pop up all over the place. With the kind of the first example of it in Brussels, really.
Yeah.
And now it's all over the place.
Yeah,
in North America.
I hadn't been so aware of the Brussels connection there, but that is cool as well. That there are so many good examples to look at that we don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah, definitely, and it's having a real impact now. And I thought it was really fun to hear Andrew talk about how the conversation, of course, has changes when Passive House is just on the take, like it's just necessary for a project now.
Yeah.
So it's it's a totally different conversation than with clients.
I mean, that's massive to have Passive House or Passive House standard equivalents being written into local building codes. And it was interesting, Andrew saying, he sort of pointed out, made me aware that there's such a variation in codes. We can't say, America is this much ahead of where we are, because there's so many different Americas when it comes to the building code. In the same way, there's so many different states in Australia. We're a little bit more lucky here. We've sort of got one regulatory body across the whole country, but we do have separate climate zones. But I think the more gets done at the local municipality and then the state rules, then that sort of starts to spread out. And what's really powerful is when those states start talking to each other through people like Andrew, and Andrew being invited into these code panels and people who are advising the policymakers. That's when the power really starts to make an effect of people getting the expertise in to make these rules. It's awesome. And that's not just saying Passive House. Andrew also alluded to building code definitions and things like glazing and air tightness and all those individual requirements, and just putting a lot more granularity, making it a lot more specific for all those separate components of what makes a good building work.
Right. And the thermal energy demand intensity, which I know came up in the conversation. TEDI, exactly. The first time I heard about TEDI was through the city of Vancouver's policies around Passive House several years ago. And TEDI is just to point out, is totally aligned with Passive House, the Passive House approach, because that thermal energy demand intensity is essentially what we target in Passive House as well. We want to bring the thermal demand very low as a priority. And so it was interesting to hear that they're using that as one of the pathways of compliance with the stretch code, and that in some cases that number is actually more stringent than the passive house heating demand number.
Yeah.
So, good stuff.
And of course, always good to hear about financial incentives for reaching these benchmarks as well. So that's really helps bring the industry along and shows commitment from those state agencies or whoever's putting rules in place. So lots of really positive stuff there. Similar to New York and places where you got those great incentives, and of course federal incentives as well. So things are really looking up when we hear from that people like Andrew are being consulted on to set up those policies.
Indeed.
Great stuff. What do we have coming up?
Yeah, March is a big month. So March 1st, we have the Passive House Accelerator Live 101 edition happening. We're going to be joined by Mariana Pickering of Emu Systems, and she's going to be presenting 10 steps to building your first passive house. Then the next day, March 2nd, and this is in North America, so add a day for you in New Zealand and Australia, we'll have episode 2 of season 2 of the Building Performance Interactive, which is our UK-based show. And that will be featuring structural fire safety testing in offsite manufactured energy efficient buildings. So join us for that on March 2nd. Then the next week, March 8th, we are joined by AJ Patton, who's a developer based in Chicago, and it's going to be for the Next Gen series of our Passive House Accelerator Live program. And he's going to be presenting how am I building 2 passive house mixed use developments at the same time. So he tells that story and the details. We are going to be in Germany as well on that week for the International Passive House Conference, which happens March 10th through 12th. And check out the bonus episodes for the episodes that just dropped with Wolfgang Feist, as well as with Jessica Groff-Smith and Jan Steiger to learn more about that. March 21st and 23rd, FIAS is doing its Retrofit Summit, and we're doing a special aligned event on the 22nd. So in between those two, that will be focused on industrialized retrofits. Lots going on, and we'll have links to it all in the show notes.
Exciting stuff. Thank you very much, Zack. We'll
Thanks, Matthew.
catch up again next week on the Passive House Podcast.